Hello and welcome to the Cycle Breaker Parents Unite podcast. Today I am going to talk about adverse childhood experiences. This is a term that has long been used in child protection, it's been used in therapeutic circles, it's been used to support children who are at risk of experiencing them right now. And it's been used to support adults who have grown up with adverse childhood experiences in their background. And there was a huge study by Kaiser Permanente, which is a company in the US. There was a huge study into the effects of adverse childhood experiences on the outcomes of the child that experienced them as they grow older. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the study and about the limitations. All studies have limitations. There is no qualitative, which is experience-based, that is questionnaires following children's outcomes as they grow. It's asking people how they feel. So quality, it's through talking and it's through analysing what people say. Or quantitative, which is what we usually think of when we think of research, which is more the natural science. It's the, how long does something take to do something? What kind of reaction do you get if you put this and this together? Well, you get numbers and you crunch the numbers and then you can say, yes, this has statistical significance or it doesn't. So every study, whether it is the qualitative or the quantitative, where you get the numbers, is nothing's perfect. So we always have to take this with a pinch of salt. And this is really, really important because adverse childhood experiences, they do affect the children who have them as they grow into adulthood. There is no denying this, and we don't need a study. Of course, we should have studies to back it up, but we don't need a study to logically think that the child who grew up with a parent who was being abused, so that the child who witnessed domestic violence, domestic abuse in the household, is going to have less good outcomes and have bad feelings and worry and stress more than the child who doesn't. This makes sense. If your father went to prison or your mother went to prison, you are, of course, more likely to struggle with the feelings of worry, maybe guilt, maybe shame, depending on how it was dealt with, and certainly anger, upset, missing a parent. So if you have that experience, which is adverse, it's not good for you, and it's in childhood, it follows that the child who has those experiences has more to work through. It's a disadvantage compared to the child who grew up in a household with two parents who either, well, I was going to say didn't argue, but that's not possible, is it? But they worked through their disagreements calmly and helpfully and modelled conflict resolution to their children. These two different households, we can logically assume that the child who grew up with the adverse experiences, which I will share with you in a minute, is going to have a more difficult time than the child who didn't. And of course, I'm a parent of three, as you know. Of course, we're always thinking, how can I support my children? How can my relationship with my husband, or wife or whatever, if, you're watching this, how can I support my children? How can I model calm? How can I model safety? And this is more difficult for people who have had adverse childhood experiences. Now, here's where it gets a bit tricky, because the study by Kaiser Permanente, which is a company, so it's a health insurance company in the United States of America. So already we know that it's going to be people who were included in the study are mostly going to be people who have health insurance. So already, we have a financial bracket of the people who join in with this study. You see where I'm going with that? We have to take everything with a pinch of salt. Now, interestingly, this study, the Kaiser Permanente study, has been replicated again and again and again. So that gives it more validity. And again, what it showed is that if you have, so they use 10 different adverse childhood experiences that they categorize, which I will share right now. And in the study, they linked if you had these childhood experiences, so the number of adverse childhood experiences that you had, as defined by only the 10 adverse childhood experiences that they came up with in the study, and so these 10 adverse childhood experiences has been used again and again and again in future research. So if you had 1 adverse childhood experiences, what were your outcomes like in future in terms of health, in terms of business, in terms of your earning power, in terms of your financial and emotional security, in terms of your relationships? What happens if you have 4 adverse childhood experiences? What happens if you have 6 out of these 10 adverse childhood experiences? And the outcomes are on the surface of it, they are pretty scary, which is why I wanted to do a podcast on it. Sorry, just have some coffee there. Because when we think of the outcomes that are linked to adverse childhood experiences, in fact, I'll share with you the adverse childhood experiences first. So they're in 3 categories. So the 3 categories are abuse and neglect and family breakdown. The family one has got lots of different names, but essentially it means family insecurity. So in terms of abuse, there are 3. There's physical abuse, sexual abuse, and verbal or emotional abuse. In terms of neglect, which is category 2, physical neglect, which is not having your physical needs met. So, the children who go to school, thinking when I used to be a class teacher, and when I used to work with families with young offenders, it would be the children who came to school dirty. It would be the children who were hungry. And not just, every now and then, because, of course, we all miss breakfast every now and then. Of course, we all forget to wash PE kit every now and then. I mean, my children don't go to school, but I've been a class teacher for years. And we know, anybody who works in child protection knows that families have rough periods and families have good periods and families have, all kinds of stuff in between. So, your kid going to school or turning up at a club with dirty kit because they didn't tell you it needed washing, that's not going to trigger anything, is it? Please no, it won't. I'm talking about the children who consistently, day after day after day, come in and, school. I've done this as a class teacher where I've had spare uniforms and a teaching assistant who has taken the child off and changed their uniform and then washed it at school, and then they've gone home in their same uniform. These are the things that signal physical neglect. And emotional neglect, which is, of course, with all these things, it's harder to discover, as emotional neglect is not having your needs met. Again, this is not, that one time you had an argument with your child, or that one time that you didn't know what to do with them when they were upset, or that one time where you were just too exhausted to deal with their stuff right now. This is systematically, over a long period of time, not listening to the child. When they're upset, not dealing with it. When they're happy, not dealing with it. When they need a parent, it not being dealt with. So this is emotional neglect over a long period of time. And 3 is family breakdown, which is, so there's 5 in this. This is a big one. A family member being depressed or having another type of mental health illness, and a diagnosed one, whether it's treated or not. I mean, of course, see, this is one of the limitations of the study, because say a family member, if a child has a mother who has undiagnosed bipolar disorder, that's going to be quite a chaotic household, and the child is going to struggle to know what to do at certain points and to understand the mother's behaviour. The child of a mother or father with depression, which is being managed, and the mum or the dad is engaging in proactive therapy, that's going to be very different. That's a very different household, isn't it? That's a very different outlook. But of course, it's just under 6 family member with depressed or mental illness. So, we do have to take this with a pinch of salt, but it is nevertheless a useful model in some ways. Number 7 is addiction to alcohol or other substances in a family member, especially a parent. Number 8 is having a parent incarcerated. Number 9 is witnessing a mother particularly a mother being abused. That could be emotional abuse, where the child has seen the mum being shouted at, being told that she's worthless, that kind of thing. It could be seeing the mother being controlled financially, or it could be what most of us think of when we think of domestic abuse, which is the violence. And number 10 is losing a parent, be that through separation or divorce or death. Again, I want to pause here, because a divorce between two parents who decide that they are not right for each other and they are doing the best thing, because unfortunately the best thing in some cases is that a relationship doesn't go forward. And if they I'm laughing because the term consciously uncouple has come up in my brain. But if they calmly separate and they agree not to argue in front of the children, and perhaps they seek support and help and they move forward calmly and in a loving way, which enables the children to feel as supported as they can be, that's very, very different to either a household where the parents don't divorce or split because they don't want to cause an adverse childhood experience because it's on the ACEs index, and yet they fight and argue and scream at each other all the time in front of the children, or the separation which is bitter and in which the parents play off the children and things. So again, we must take it with a pinch of salt because it's never that simple. Having said that, the ACEs model is quite useful. Now, excuse me a sec. When we look at the ACEs model, which tells us that children who have certainly 4 or more ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, in their background as they grow up, they are at higher risk for negative outcomes. Now, outcomes is such a tricky word because on the one hand it's jargon and it means nothing, but it actually covers a lot. So I'll drill down into outcomes. So in terms of risk, in terms of the health risks, according to the study and the other studies that are, that followed, where it was replicated again and again and again with a wide audience, it's been taken to prisons where they have unsurprisingly discovered that a lot of the people in prisons have a number of adverse childhood experiences. Health conditions include being at higher risk of heart disease, of cancer, of asthma, of stroke, of diabetes, and of teen pregnancy or unplanned pregnancy, which I guess comes under a health outcome. In terms of behaviours, people who have 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, and the percentages, even if you have 1 adverse childhood experiences, which frankly I'm looking at the list and I don't know that many people who don't have a single adverse childhood experience or some version of that. I mean, of course I work with cycle breaker parents, so it's a self-selecting audience, but what I'm trying to say is many people will have 1. 4 is quite a high number. People even have 6 and more. So in terms of behaviours, people with more adverse childhood experiences, 4 or more, are more likely to engage in dangerous behaviours or risky behaviours like drinking, like smoking, that kind of thing, and taking risks. Socioeconomically, so basically, financially and how you live, if you have 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, you are more likely to be unemployed. You are more likely to have up to high school level education and not more. I'm going to drill this apart because hopefully you're listening to this or you're watching this and you're going, really? Really? So you've just said that adverse childhood experiences are really common, and yet everybody with adverse childhood experiences is supposed to not have any money and engage in risky behaviour and die earlier. and it's not quite that simple. So I am going to pick this apart in a second, don't worry. Repeating patterns. So you're more likely to repeat the patterns. You're more likely to become an abuser. And so to beat your wife, or to engage in physical and emotional neglect, or to be a physical, sexual, verbal, emotional abuser, or to go lean into addictions if you have adverse childhood experiences than if you have none. To me, that actually does make sense, because we know, and you can certainly look at Gabor Mate's work on this, because he's done a lot of research into the field of addiction and trauma. And he states, and many other researchers state, that addiction is a reaction to trauma. So if you have childhood trauma, because really that's what the adverse childhood experience model is, it's a way of looking at early childhood trauma and its effects. And actually that's where it stops, because that's where we need to start engaging our critical brains. So this is me kind of doing a research critical podcast and interview here. Well, it's not an interview, it's just me, hello, monologue. So you can probably tell that I actually am really interested in the ACEs model, and I find it very useful. Broadly, here are some problems with it. In terms of adverse childhood experiences, physical, sexual, emotional abuse, physical and emotional neglect. In terms of family member being depressed, having a mental illness, addiction to alcohol or other substances, parent being incarcerated, witnessing mother being abused, and losing a parent through separation, divorce, or death. Yes, these make sense. These are all adverse childhood experiences. How about if you're a refugee? How about if you grew up in a war zone and you had to flee with your family? Technically, that's not an adverse childhood experience. Are we saying that this is not a source of trauma? We should not be. No. So you could have a person, a young person in front of you who, and I once taught a child who had come to me after, I think she'd been in the country for 4 months over the summer, and then she come to me in September. And before that, she was in Iraq. This was 2012. She was in Iraq and she had seen some really horrible stuff, and her dad had passed away, and then her mum had brought her to England, where she had ended up in my class. That's not technically an adverse childhood experience. The losing the father is the adverse childhood experience, but the witnessing violence, the being part of war, and the refugee experience is not technically an adverse childhood experience. There are loads of other things, like what if you have a massive car crash when you're 8 years old? Technically, that's not an adverse childhood experience. We know it is. So yeah, it doesn't cover everything. So that is a limitation. There's also this really incredible statistic, which I will have to back up because I can't remember the research. It was shared by Dr. Jessica Taylor. I will link to her work in the show notes on YouTube and on the podcast, because I like to do a double, because some people like to watch and some people like to listen. And she states she is a psychologist working with trauma. And she states that 50%, apparently it's like 50% of social workers have adverse childhood experiences. And I watched another training thing about ACEs, about adverse childhood experiences in the States. And it was aimed, so it was a continuing professional development talk delivered to early years professionals. And the speaker was she was saying that when they do this, so at the start of it's like a 3-day workshop, at the start of the workshop, they give out the ACEs questionnaire, because what you do is you go through and you say, have I experienced this? Have I experienced this? Have I experienced this? And quite simply, a tick for yes is a score, so you can score out of 10. Of course, we know critically that you can have other stuff in your life which constitute adverse childhood experiences. So you can have more than 10, or you can have a technical score of 0 and a lot of other ones that aren't qualified under the ACEs model. So she gives out the ACEs questionnaire anonymously to the group. And when it comes back and they collate all the data, she said reliably every time that she had ever delivered this to early years professionals, it had shown that early years professionals have a higher than average for the population score of ACEs. Now, to be an early years professional, you have to have a degree, you have to have a teaching qualification, and usually there is also an additional EYFS, early years foundational stage, certainly in the UK, extra qualification, because the early years is so important. Now, that doesn't tally, does it, with if you have ACEs, you will have less than high school level qualifications, because you have to be extremely qualified. In fact, everybody in the school system, you can ask any teacher that you know. Certainly my husband is a secondary school teacher. I've taught in Key Stage 2, which is age 7 to 11. I've actually taught all ages, it's 7 to 11. And I've taught in secondary schools in special units. You know, I've done hard stuff, and I've worked with a lot of children and young people of different ages. Everybody in education knows early years is the most difficult and it's the most precious and it's the most powerful. And that tells me, and a lot of other people, that people with ACEs often, you know, want to go into the caring professionals to make sure it doesn't happen again. I have ACEs. I work my entire career, even up until I started being a parenting coach in this form. I worked with young offenders, I worked with families, I worked in schools, I worked with refugee children. Many, many, many of us are highly qualified and working in academic careers where we support other people. If you go through, you know, when you think of stories of entrepreneurs, successful entrepreneurs, and they'll say, you know, I had to make my own food from the age of 5, and they have adverse childhood experiences and they spur them on to greatness. So here is where I really want to take the conclusion. So I've explained what ACEs are, I've explained the standard risks, and in terms of the population, you know, in terms of the general population, they seem to be, generally they hold. But what I really, really want to say is, now I've shown you a few limitations, I want to point out that if you have ACEs, if you have adverse childhood experiences in your background, you do not have to have the outcomes that are predicted, because they're predicted, and they're predicted on a model, which doesn't mean that it's fully true. So if you are listening to this, watching this, and you're thinking, well, I saw my mum being abused, and my parents were both alcoholics, and I was beaten, so I had physical abuse and physical neglect, and also I was emotionally abused because they were horrible to me when they were drunk or high. That's 5 adverse childhood experiences. That's half of the score out of 10. So if you say you're listening to this or watching this and you're thinking, uh-oh, am I screwed? Am I destined to repeat my pattern and abuse my children? Because I have dark days, and I could really easily sometimes lean into alcohol, or, you know, I could really easily explode at my kids, and I find it really hard not to. In fact, sometimes I do. Am I cursed? This is the real root of it. Am I cursed because I had adverse childhood experiences? Am I going to be a victim for the rest of my life because I have had adverse childhood experiences? I want to tell you no. And actually, when you look around with the critical lens, like, yes, ACEs is an interesting model. Yes, ACEs is useful. And, you know, yes, you're disadvantaged. There's no two ways about it. You're disadvantaged if people treated you badly when you were a child and you didn't deserve it, and it wasn't your fault. It is never the child's fault. ACEs model covers from 0 to 18, so it's all the way through, you know, most of the teen years as well. It's never the child's fault. So if you're an adult or even a young person, you're listening to this or watching this, know this. Yes, you have a disadvantage or 4 disadvantages or whatever. Yes, perhaps you have other ACEs that aren't in the model. No, it's not a life sentence. No, you are not going to become a teen parent. You know, and maybe you were a teen parent. It's not because you were cursed. Please know that just because you had adverse childhood experiences doesn't mean that the trajectory of your life is now set in a train track for failure and further trauma and repeating patterns and addiction and dying early and having cancer. Like, this is not true. This is not what the model shows. Now, some people interpret it like this and they talk about it a lot. And Dr. Jessica Taylor says quite frequently, I mean, she rips it to shreds. It's a wonderful video on her Facebook page, which I will link in the show notes. people like to characterize things, don't they? And have a caricature because it's easy, because it's simple, but it's not trauma informed and it's not helpful. So take the ACEs model, take what you need from it, and then shove it, and then make your own choices. Yes, I've had this. What do I do about it? So if you have ACEs and you're thinking, well, now I'm a parent, how do I make sure my children don't have ACEs? You know by now what I'm always going to say. It's healing plus skills. That is how you get to be the parent that you want to be and the person that you want to be. You go in and you heal those wounds. So if you have emotional abuse in your background, if you have sexual abuse in your background, if you saw your mother being beaten, if you lost a parent because of death or separation or a messy, horrible divorce, or even an amicable divorce that was really, really upsetting, you have the right to find a coach or a therapist, whichever suits you better, whichever makes you feel safe. You have the right to seek support to heal those wounds. And if you didn't have skills shown to you, so when you were a child and you had emotional needs, I'm thinking about things like emotional neglect and emotional abuse. If your parents or carers were not able to meet your emotional needs, you may find it harder to meet your child's needs, because one, you will have triggers, which are those wounds that aren't healed, and they will make it harder to remain calm when you're upset. And they will be things that, if you have grief from your childhood, or if yelling is a big thing, because that's a signal for distress in your brain, because when you were yelled at as a child, that meant bad things were going to happen. If your child is yelling at you, you have that trigger that other people who didn't have that experience won't have. This is where the ACEs model is a bit useful. And you have these triggers that other people don't have. So you can heal those triggers, which will make it easier to see your child's behavior as a communication of their needs, and then to meet their needs, because you won't be acting from a place of your hurt because you've healed it, or, you're working towards it, because we can never be like tick box healed. That doesn't work like that. We have to keep doing it and doing it and doing it. This is part of the human condition. And you can learn skills. You can learn what to do when a child has a meltdown, or a huge tantrum in Sainsbury's or, Walmart, or wherever, your local supermarket is. Big C here. Let's just change names. Whatever in Vietnam, like Mega Market, which is ours, which is as scarily huge as you can imagine. And, and you can learn what to do, which isn't shouting or smacking or, picking up by their t-shirt and dragging them out. You can learn different ways to do that. You can learn how to acknowledge their feelings. You can learn how to support them when they aren't invited to a party, or when they fall over, or when they're trying and they can't get something right, or when they fail an exam. You can learn how to support them, and that will move you forward to being the parent that you want to be. So that's healing plus skills is the parent you want to be. So this is nearly half an hour, which is about how long I like a podcast or when I'm doing interviews to be. So I'm going to round it up. Quick summary. ACEs, there are 10 of them. I will link to the list. You can take the ACEs test if you wish. Know this. It is a flawed model and it is not trauma informed. And that's okay. Because just because it exists doesn't mean it's the gospel truth. Just because other people in social care use it, just because, it's standard, when you get into the realm of child protection and healing and parenting and cycle breaking, you will hear ACEs pinged around all the time as the acronym. Oh, how many ACEs do they have? Oh, we need to support this child so they don't collect ACEs. It's thrown about all the time. And you know that it's only as useful as we can critically assess it. So that. So there's the ACEs model. You can see how many you've got if you choose, and know that people with ACEs are at a disadvantage. There's no two ways about that. There is shown, being very, very careful about extrapolating data, especially when it is going to make people feel bad about themselves. There is research that shows that people with adverse childhood experiences, particularly 4 or more, may have less good outcomes for their life and their future. And that doesn't have to be true for you. You can heal, you can learn skills, you can become the parent that you want to be, and you can become a much happier person. At the end of the day, it wasn't your fault. Whatever happened from when you were 0 to 18, especially 0 to 7, is a crucial period in your life. And it wasn't your fault because you were a child. And now that you're an adult, I'm assuming you're an adult listening to this. If you're, say, a teenager, well done you for getting started on the journey already. Feel free to message me. Really, really do. I think you're incredible. So now that you're grown up, shall we say, not that I ever really feel grown up, but now that you're older, you have a choice. And the choice is that you blindly, and I'm not judging this, I'm absolutely not judging. Feel free to go into the podcast, this one with Aoife Griffin, where we talk about it's never too late to heal. It's a really, really good one. Essentially, you can say, oh, I had adverse childhood experiences and that's it, my life is over now. And you can lean into that. And I'm going to call it. I'm going to call it and say that's the kind of the victim mode. And I have been in that mode, and I know many, many people who have, and there comes a tipping point where people say, do you know what, I'm not having this anymore. And if you blindly go through, well, the ACEs model says that I'm not going to get a good job. You're not going to get a good job. The ACEs model says that I'm going to lean into addiction, and that's okay because I have ACEs. Well, the inevitable is going to happen there, isn't it? And you have, I want to empower you, because I don't mean that in a judgmental way. I mean that you have power, because just because you have ACEs in your background doesn't mean that your life is over, doesn't mean that your trajectory is terrible, doesn't mean that you are never going to earn money, you are going to become an abuser, and that you're going to die early. It's just not true. It's just not true. You have power. You have power to seek support. You have power to read books. You have power to learn one skill a week that will support your parenting. You have power to change because you are in control of your own life. So I'm going to leave that here. Thank you so, so much for your time. I'm going to, because this podcast and video is coming out today, which is the 9th of August 2012. No, 2012. That's my dyslexicism. 2021. Oh, and I've been talking about 2012. The Own Your Parenthood 5-day free workshop is starting in my Facebook group, Cycle Breaker Parents Unite, so you don't forget, on the 13th of August. So that's this Friday. All you have to do is be in a Facebook group, and you can request a workbook when you're in there, or you can sign up at the email link and it will just get automatically emailed to you. Very proud of that. And then I just pop up at 8:30 p.m. Hanoi time, which is 2:30 p.m. UK time, or you can just world clock it on just Hanoi. It's the capital of Vietnam, which is where I am. And I will deliver 5 plus bonus days, so 6 days of free content, free learning about the subconscious brain, about parenting skills, about how to get off the power seesaw when we're with our pet, when we're with our children, about what trauma is, about what being a cycle breaker parent is, about how we get to choose the lifestyle that we want. And it's really, really awesome, and it's free. And it comes around every 6 to 8 weeks, because at the end of the workshop I open the Turning Point, which is my 6 months amazing cycle breaker program, my coaching program, which involves, you'll be surprised to know, healing plus skills to become the parent you want to be. So if you're listening to this and it's September or it's October or November or any time in the future, know this, that if you come and join us in the group, every few weeks it will come along. And in the meantime, you can hang out in the group, and every Friday I deliver free training. And it looks a bit like this. It's usually a bit more interactive because this is me recording an interview and a podcast. But we do lots of resources. There's a conversation that buzzes about cycle breaking, about parenting, about healing, and it's very, very exciting and loving and safe place to be. So this is my invitation for you to come and join us on the workshop and to come and hang out in the Facebook group. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope you have a really, really lovely week.